This presentation looks at the factors affecting social acceptance of renewable energy and transmission projects. We're going to look at the research that we've done at the Conservation Council, focus groups and a survey, talk about the importance of community influence and community benefits, look at how people evaluate renewable energy and transmission projects from the lens of fairness, look at some narratives that we tested, talk about the results, and make some recommendations.
Our motivation for doing this study was to explore how we can limit the barriers to renewable energy and transmission projects from pace, proportion, and people. Pace refers to the climate policies to reach zero-emitting electricity systems in Canada in less than 15 years. Proportion refers to electrification modeling suggesting the electricity system will at least double in size to power transportation, homes, and businesses. And people. On the one hand, Canadians favor renewable energy from the wind, sun, and water, but they also oppose new renewable energy and transmission projects, delaying or canceling projects.
To do our research, we used a mixed method approach that involved focus groups as well as a survey. The focus groups were held in the first week of March 2022. There were 7 focus groups that were coupled where we expect transmission interties potentially could help deliver, say, hydropower to provinces that still rely on coal. So coupled by New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, we had one with the Atlantic, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, British Columbia and Alberta. We also had sessions where men and women were in separate groups, partly because on a technical issue, we find women won't speak as much if they're with men who are much more engaged on these issues. The Atlantic focus group was a mixed group. For our survey, which we did the first week of April, we used narrative research, just as we did for the focus groups. 1,800 Canadians were surveyed using an online panel. And we measured things like trust and fairness. We looked at narratives that we had created based on the focus groups to see how they might influence people's perspectives on acceptability of renewable energy and transmission projects, as well as their beliefs about how fair the projects were. One of the things we looked at in the focus groups was the idea of influence and benefits. We looked at what kinds of influence people wanted to have with respect to renewable energy and transmission projects, and what kind of benefits did they want to see. And I share this introduction with the question, what would happen if we actually listened to the people? Well, the one thing that would happen is we'd be doing something in contrast to the traditional decide, announce, and defend strategy of energy development. Instead, when we think about community influence and community benefits, we're trying to look at the idea of renewable energy and transmission investments in a way that leads to better consultation and engagement and collaboration. On the question of how much influence should communities or citizens have over where projects are located, the focus groups were clear. People want to have access and standing. They want to participate, and for communities to have a choice. They want to have a say in where projects go, for example. They also want to be given a set of options. Some say they'd even like to be able to vote on a set of options. Others say they want to be consulted. And they'll accept what the decisions of others are because they are the experts or in a decision-making position. All of the people we talked to, though, also had concerns about power imbalance from vested interests. They were concerned about bias, and they really believed that neutral experts should be available to advise citizens on proposals that are being made. What benefits, if anything, should communities or indigenous communities expect when renewable projects are proposed? And in this case, when thinking about benefits, people talked about the need for education in the sense of they wanted to be able to fully participate, which means they needed to be informed. But they also wanted personal and social financial benefits. They were thinking about things like jobs, economic partnerships, incentives or rebates, tax breaks, community sponsorships, for example, as well as environmental benefits. They also shared concerns about community impact without gaining a community benefit. There were several stories about being hosts to wind projects, for example, but of course not sharing in the benefits either because there were community sponsorships from the companies building the projects, or there were lower property sales tax or power rates, or even just as much just as important to people was knowing that the power generated is the power that the community relies on. Some people talked about as well feeling a sense of community pride for being hosts to a renewable energy project. We all know that there can be challenges when thinking about transmission. So we did have our focus group participants talk about transmission, and we shared a statement with them that we asked them to react to. The statement was, energy experts say we need transmission lines to increase the reliability of renewable energy, either to bring in hydropower when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing, or when other storage technologies are not available. Participants in the focus groups responded by being open to sharing, essentially, bringing hydro in across to other provinces that are relying maybe on coal or oil. They said we do it now for gas, so why not? Others see transmission as a necessary evil. Generally, people raised concerns about view effects, about health effects, and they always mentioned alternatives, for example, whether lines should be buried. Some worry that lines are just for export or are concerned about the risk to sovereignty and energy security if a province is too reliant on electricity from out of province. One of the key insights from the focus groups was that people are evaluating the ideas of renewable energy and transmission through the lens of fairness. And interestingly, it shouldn't be a surprise, but it was great to find academics have a framework for that. And it can be very helpful to guide policy design and communications framing. There are at least 6 different ways that people think about fairness. In this graph or framework sketch, you'll see that people are comparing fairness through at least 3 interpersonal and intergenerational ways. So looking at interpersonal, what they call interpersonal temporal comparison, which is basically a comparison to myself, to my own outcomes. And you could think of an outcome being whether or not you're financially worse off. In terms of interpersonal comparison, people are looking at a comparison to themselves, but also others. In this case, am I worse off relative to others? And they're also looking at comparisons across groups within the current generation. So, for example, is everybody affected equally? Are the outcomes proportional to income, or are they proportional to the contribution someone's making to the problem? And then there are intergenerational comparisons. So in this case, a comparison across groups, including future generations. And in this case, people are thinking about protection of nature, environment, and future generations. So how does the analysis from our focus groups and the framework that we discovered fit with other research? Well, it turns out very well. A recent Nature climate change study, that's what we call a meta-analysis, looked at 51 academic papers covering 89 studies and over 119,000 people. And what popped out on top? Fairness and effectiveness, something we also found in other research as being important. People are not sure how effective many climate solutions are. And in this case, the third element that was important was trust in institutions. And you'll see that when we move to the survey, we also looked at that question of trust. In our survey, we tried to measure trust in stakeholders. We also tried to measure trust in a more sophisticated way. Often you'll just say, do you trust or don't trust? Strongly agree to disagree. But trust is actually more complicated, includes different concepts as well as skepticism. And we also measured the perception of fairness and acceptability of clean electricity standard regulations after exposure or no exposure to narratives. So let's talk about trust for a moment. We often, as I mentioned, just think of trust as what we call a unidimensional idea. So do you trust or you don't trust? But that's actually not very helpful. You're often in a situation where people are thinking about different things when they're thinking about trust. And so we also measure trust in a multidimensional way. So we had two questions on that. And on the basic type of trust, trust in stakeholders, we see some very worrying trends, especially with respect to friends and family. So in this slide, we're looking at the most basic idea of trust, whether you strongly trust to strongly distrust somebody. And we looked at a number of stakeholders who would be sources of information on electricity issues. And what we see is that friends and family are ranked number one trusted sources. This is the strongly trust and trust results. Academics are second, followed by electrical utilities, energy industry associations, government departments, environmental groups, energy regulators, and last, retailers of electronics and appliances. What's interesting about this is that there's been a trend over the last couple of years where people increasingly trust friends and family on almost any topic and increasingly distrust institutions. And we see this result here, and it stands for all the demographics except left-leaning respondents. All other demographics rank friends and family number one. Left-leaning respondents rank academics number one, friends and family second, and environmental groups third. So the question is this a result that's a concern? Well, what I looked at was what I call the soft score. What are the results in terms of people saying they slightly trust or neutral, or are they slightly distrust? And we see very high soft scores, so quarter to 60% of the population kind of not being neutral. So that's a good sign. But when you also look at the margin of trust to distrust, so if you think of, I had 50% say trust and 10% say distrust, that would be a 4-to-1. That friends and family trust, this friends and family response is 17 times more trusting than distrust. Academics have a high level of 7 times trust to distrust. But if you look at the bottom in terms of retailers, it's about just under 3. Environmental groups, it's 2.5 times trust to distrust, and so on. So I would say, we've got a trend that maybe is concerning, but we also have lots of room to inform and to build trust in institutions important to communicating and sharing information on electricity. We also looked at trust from a more complex point of view, what we call a combination of general trust and skepticism. On the left, you'll see ideas of general trust, that when we're doing these kind of simple questions, do you trust or don't, you're often, as I understand it from the academics, you're measuring integrity. But there's more to it than that. So the measures that we had looked at whether or not people thought government, in this case, the federal government, had the skills or was competent to regulate a non-polluting electricity system. Were they acting in the public interest with regard to those regulations, making decisions about regulating in a way that is fair, providing all relevant information about regulating, listening to what ordinary people think about regulating a non-polluting electricity system. And you can see that just a quarter to as low as 15% strongly agree or agree. So low levels of general trust in the federal government. On the skepticism side, we asked 3 questions. Does the federal government distort facts in its favor regarding regulation of a non-polluting electricity system? Is it too influenced by provinces, utilities, and industry? And does it change policies regarding regulation without good reasons? Once again, we see that about a quarter only strongly agree or agree. So again, low levels of general trust, but also low levels of skepticism. And that's something that we can work with, because it's important that we trust institutions if we need those institutions to make decisions that are good for the environment. Again, I looked at how did this break out from the soft score idea, and again, over half the respondents just aren't really sure. It's not something they're thinking about just yet. Again, giving us lots of room to influence outcomes over time if we communicate well. But some important results here. If you look at the first one, provides all relevant information about regulating a non-polluting electricity system, we see that people are 3 times more disagree. The margin of disagree to agree is over 3 times. They also are pretty strong in their view that government is distorting and changing policies and to influence. There's about a 2 times agree to disagree there. Importantly, on this one here, it listens to what ordinary people think. It was about, just over 1.5 times. But what's important here is that both on providing all the relevant information and listening to people, women in particular are very strongly of that belief. We wanted to understand whether the way we talk about electrifying our lives and getting to what we call the net zero grid by 2035, we wanted to know if narratives could influence how people feel about renewable energy and transmission projects. We, through the focus groups, looked at an initial set of narratives, and what we found was a lot of reactions and a lot of information from the focus group participants, but it was a hard balancing act to figure out how to both be clear and factual and realistic when we were making statements, but also to do it in a way that doesn't trigger arguments or skepticism or resentments. And we experienced all of those emotions, if you will, and evaluations in the focus groups.
Our experimental narratives were informed by the focus groups and were divided, if you will, in 2 kinds of ways. The first narrative leans more toward self-referencing, so what we call intrapersonal effects. Talked about things like cost of living and affordability and so on, saving money. It also referenced climate change in a more matter-of-fact way, suggested general momentum for renewable energy, so no specific details. It didn't use absolute numbers. It uses a range of numbers, and it ended with references to ideas about fairness. The second narrative was more collective in its orientation, so more interpersonal effects, so impacts on the social or personal side, how we relate to others, how our effects on myself relate to others. And it spoke more in detail to climate change. It did use absolutes and years, no specific numbers and dollar references, and it did end with ideas about fairness. And both of these narratives then reflect kind of the feedback we got from um, uh, focus group participants. But the big idea is that the first narrative is more personally oriented, the second one is more socially oriented. So for the experiment, what happened was we divided our group into three, so 1,800 people into three equal-sized groups. And 2 of the groups saw narratives, and the one group, the control group, did not see the narrative. And all of the participants answered the same questions in the survey. And this particular question about unfairness, so this is just a general idea of unfairness or fairness, the question was, as part of its climate plan, the federal government will regulate electricity suppliers so that by 2035, they produce little to no greenhouse gas emissions. The policy will increase the size of the overall electricity system in Canada to supply the power needed for electric vehicles, trucks, transit systems. Investments could increase power rates, but household power bills would not increase if homes have energy efficiency upgrades and vehicles shift from gasoline to electricity. How fair is this policy to you? And what we see is that the people who saw the more self-referencing narrative felt the policy was more unfair. And they also thought it was more unfair relative to themselves. Um, and the collective narrative, people felt it was less unfair. They had a lower score for unfairness, and they were less likely to think it was personally unfair. Of course, this is all relative to the control group. We also measured acceptability. And in this case, we asked, still thinking about the federal government's plan to regulate electricity suppliers so that by 2035, they produce little to no greenhouse gas emissions. How acceptable is this policy measure to you? And again, both narratives generated higher acceptability scores relative to the control group, but the collective narrative did so on a greater basis. And it also had a much lower unacceptability score. You'll recall that we've been looking at this idea of fairness from the fairness framework and the six potential fairness outcomes. And so we had a scale in the survey that looked at that. And here are the results. What we see is that, again, still probing, still thinking about the federal government's plan to regulate, that on the first two items, people with low incomes will be affected more than people with high incomes, and people who consume the most electricity will be affected the most strongly. We see that all of the respondents actually scored those the same or relatively high. And so there was no experimental impact on those. You can see slight differences there, but they're not significant. But what was important was that the narratives did strongly improve the perception that the policy would be good for intergenerational fairness. As we've been noting all the way through, the self-referencing narrative did increase people's perception that they would be worse off compared to others. So what's interesting here about these results is that what we're seeing is that this reflection or evaluation of how a policy is fair relative to others is really the driving dynamic, as opposed to myself personally. And that if you talk about personal fairness in terms of money triggers, in particular, we see that then people do perceive that they will be worse off relative to others. We looked a little bit at some of the demographics, and what's interesting here is that the self-referencing narrative was more popular with Greens and NDP, but the collective narrative is far more acceptable, if you will, in terms of its positive influence on a broader spectrum of society. So if you're looking at cross-cultural and cross-party kind of influences, the collective narrative performs well. And it definitely, in terms of the self-referencing narrative, did not do well with suburban dwellers and visible minorities. In terms of acceptability, again, the self-referencing narrative was somewhat more, it had a bigger influence on acceptable scores for Greens and folks in Alberta, Ontario, and Newfoundland, some rural dwellers, but again, negative for suburban dwellers and people out east. And in terms of the collective narrative, a broader positive influence cross-sector in terms of party, cross-sector in terms of culture. So what do we get to with this research? I'd suggest that we just want to avoid triggering debate and skepticism if we can do so in our communications. And so in terms of language, it seems reasonable to think about avoiding absolutes. Why give people something to react to when we can say one solution or cleaner? We can minimize debates about numbers or years by using a range of numbers or talking about action now. And we can also use comparatives to help people understand how the new ideas in terms of electricity relate to the existing sources of electricity. And so people did say in the focus groups they found it very helpful when we said wind and solar are cheaper than coal, oil, gas, and nuclear. Obviously, the research seems to suggest that speaking to fairness outcomes does help in terms of increasing acceptability, and that's what we're after. But we still need to do some careful work around the idea of showing momentum. And research is really suggesting we want to show that we can do this, that action is actually happening today. But you don't want to be so high level as to sound like a politician. We need to figure out how do you make very specific local references in a national narrative. So there's some work to do there. And I think we need to further test this idea of security and sovereignty, and how people may or may not be concerned about that when it comes to the idea of sharing transmission to bring power in from other provinces in terms of hydro, say, for example, to get off of coal. So how did we end up with the idea of what our narrative could look like after all of this research? So let me just read to you the 3 paragraphs that I would suggest kind of cover what the research tells us. The first thing to say is collective action problems seem to be best served by collection action narratives, and that shouldn't surprise anyone. And so here we go. Electricity made by burning coal, oil, and gas pollutes the air and makes weather extreme. We see how floods, heat waves, and forest fires harm the health and safety of Canadians. Scientists tell us the world has to change how we use energy now if we are to keep people and nature safe. One way to solve climate change is to build non-polluting sources of electricity to power electric vehicles and transit systems, our homes, and businesses. We need billions of dollars of investment to renew Canada's electricity system. Electricity made using wind turbines is cheaper than using coal, oil, gas, and nuclear. When transmission lines connect provinces, non-polluting power reliably reaches Canadians. To keep power bills affordable, though, we must use electricity efficiently. We can pay less to power an electric vehicle compared to a gasoline vehicle. Securing these energy savings costs money. Canadians need financial incentives so electric vehicles and retrofitting homes are affordable. We need to train workers so that we have the expertise to retrofit homes and businesses. We also need to ensure citizens and communities have a say about what renewable energy projects, where renewable energy projects and transmission go, the size of projects, and have a chance to partner and profit from projects. In terms of recommendations about framing and policy, I'd say define fair, especially relative to others and future generations and nature. We really want to front load in our communications our desire for policy to protect low-income households, and that we're looking for progressive effects, meaning that we want outcomes to be proportional to the contribution to the problem, proportional to ability to pay. And we need to be demanding communities and citizens have the right to access, influence, education, and expertise in order for them to participate in the decision making. In terms of building trust, let's think about the implications in terms of low levels of trust in implementing institutions, given that the meta-analysis said it was the 3rd most important variable. One way we could be looking at on the one hand to keep governments honest, but on the other hand, building trust in implementing institutions, is to demand transparency, public input, open access to information, and enforcement to raise government trust, and potentially spending more of our communications time challenging the industry and utility players who are preventing progress or not performing to the ability that they have relative to their contribution to the problem or to their ability to pay. What do we make of this issue of the rise of trust in friends and family? Are we focusing on building the expertise of friends and family? How do we deal with this trend of increasing reliance on people essentially who are probably quite uninformed about electricity policy or many of the other issues we might be campaigning on? What is it that we might do around the environmental groups? And while this study might be an outlier, let's think about maintaining and building trust in environmental groups to play their role. And we are on the path in terms of our focus on justice and just transition. But I do think that from a communications point of view, these ideas are less accessible potentially than the idea of fairness and fairness outcomes. And it can be triggering, particularly if we're trying to reach people in the center right. I'd also suggest that our policy design and program design proposals think about how do we address all 6 fairness evaluations. So thank you for listening to this presentation on the factors that affect social acceptance of renewable energy and transmission projects. Since we can't speak to each other and engage in a conversation, how might you engage with this material and apply it in your own work? And thinking about how these messaging insights can improve or facilitate the objectives that you have in your own communications. Thank you.
One solution to climate change is to use non-polluting electricity to power vehicles, homes, and businesses. Electricity made using wind and solar is cheaper than using coal, oil, gas, and nuclear. To deliver cleaner electricity across Canada, we must renew Canada's electricity system. Renewing Canada's electricity system will be hard work, but we are already building wind and solar projects today, creating jobs for workers and economic benefits. In addition to building out local and regional renewable energy supply, we need to use electricity efficiently to keep the cost of living down. We have the expertise to retrofit homes and businesses so they use 30 to 50% less energy than today. Shifting to an energy efficient or electric vehicle can save drivers even more compared to the average gasoline vehicle. It does cost money up front, however, so to secure these energy savings, we need to help Canadians. We need financial incentives so electric vehicles and retrofitting homes are affordable. To build the social support we needed to modernize Canada's electricity system, we must ensure citizens and communities can contribute to decisions about renewable energy and transmission project location, the size of projects, and have a chance to partner and profit from renewing our electricity system. The second reference, as I mentioned, is more collective in orientation. Electricity made by burning coal, oil, and gas pollutes the air and makes weather extreme. We see how floods, heat waves, and forest fires harm the health and safety of Canadians. Scientists tell us the world has less than 10 years to change how we use energy if we are to keep people and nature safe. To solve climate change, we need non-polluting sources of electricity to power electric vehicles and transit systems, our homes, and businesses. We need billions of dollars of investment to renew Canada's electricity system. Electricity made using wind turbines is cheaper than using coal, oil, gas, and nuclear. When transmission lines connect provinces, non-polluting power reliably reaches Canadians. To keep power bills affordable, though, we must use electricity efficiently. We can pay less to power an electric vehicle compared to a gasoline vehicle. Securing these energy savings costs money. Canadians need financial incentives, so electric vehicles and retrofitting homes are affordable. We need to train workers so we have the expertise to retrofit homes and businesses. We also need to ensure citizens and communities have a say about where energy projects and transmission go, the size of projects, and have a chance to partner and profit from projects. So similarities between the two narratives in terms of the fairness aspect, but differences in terms of how the narratives are framed.